Hello and welcome to ICANN Media. I'm your host, Rob Hislop. On today's show, we're going to introduce you to a university professor who has just completed a study, and it turns out that it's something that many people might find controversial. The conclusion, certainly contrary to what many people believe when it comes to the levels of polluting being done by companies in the oil sands. Roland Hall is a professor at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. He joins us now live via Skype. Hello, Roland. Thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Hi, Rob.
Roland, you are part of a group of scientists at both the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier who have concluded that the mining being done at the oil sands in northern Alberta does not appear to be boosting metal levels in the Athabasca Delta. Can you give us a brief overview of your study?
All right. So what we did is we were working down in the Athabasca Delta, about 200 kilometers downstream in Fort McMurray, where a lot of that surface mining is. And we realized that we were collecting sediment records from lakes in that area. And we realized that deep in those sediment records, they contained sediment that the river had carried and put into those lakes. And so what we realized is that we could measure what the metal levels were like in the river sediment carried by the river before oil sands industry began. So it gave us a kind of a baseline level that we could use to compare in a scientifically rigorous way against what the current levels are today to get an estimate of how much oil sands has caused perhaps an increase in those metal concentrations.
From what I understand, you also feel as though the approach he used is quite unique.
That's right. This hasn't been done for metals in the Athabasca River. It has really not been done around the world. And so I guess part of the reason is that people who study lakes tend to be interested in the lakes, and they don't think they can say something about a river. And people who work in the rivers recognize that the sediments at the bottom move and shift over time. And so you don't get a good record where you can go back to pre-industrial levels. Okay, and so for the Athabasca River, really it's been pointed out over and over again that a key missing piece to evaluate to what extent oil sands industry is polluting the Athabasca River has been an absence of knowledge of what the natural levels are.
So tell us, what are the thoughts on, I guess your thoughts on the conclusions of the study?
We were surprised, I suppose, based on, other conclusions you see, headlines from previous studies and so on. But what we found, so what we did is we constructed, we were able to determine what the natural metal concentrations carried in sediment by the Athabasca River are, or were, before the industry. And what we did is we then collected publicly available data collected by a monitoring agency where they had measured at the same lab using the same techniques for measuring metals, the concentrations at the bottom of the river between 2010 and 2013, so about 40 years after the oil sands industry began. And we made the fair comparison, and we found that the current levels by the monitoring data lie within the range of natural values. And so there's really no evidence that there's been an elevation in concentrations of these 8 metals that we report on since, above natural levels.
And I'm quite certain it's absolutely no surprise to you that the results of your study certainly contradict others that have been done in the region.
All right. Well, to some extent, I don't think it really contradicts other data. I think it adds to it, but it comes up with conclusions that, haven't been widely, that are, I guess, perhaps contradictory. So we do know that the oil sands emits contaminants, including metals. There's been some studies where people have measured metal levels in the snow at different distances away from the surface mining north of Fort McMurray. And we know that contaminants like metals and organic contaminants known as PAHs are there. They're at higher concentrations close to the industry, and they're at lower concentrations as you go further away. And there's sort of a zone of 20 to 50 kilometers where you can measure increased amounts of these metals. Okay. We also know that most of those metals are in soot and dust particles that maybe come from upgraders and from dust off the machines that do the mining. And they also, within that 50-kilometer radius, includes a stretch of the Athabasca River. So it piles up in the snow and, of course, in the summer, straight onto the river. And so certainly we understand that some level of contaminants fall on the land and the river near the oil sands industry. The big question has been, to what extent is that important in terms of affecting ecosystems and human health and things like that, wildlife down at the end of that river? And that's been a big point of concern. The one thing is that a lot of these contaminants will accumulate over the 4 to 6 months of the winter with the snow, and then they will, then get potentially mobilized with the snow melt. And so there have been suggestions that because we can detect, higher levels of contaminants near the oil sands, that this will then come as a pulse off the landscape and into the river during the snow melt.
You're obviously familiar with the work that's been done in the region when it comes to other research papers and the fact that they are diametrically opposed when it comes to the findings to your paper. You, though, point out that you think that these studies are very different from the one that you finished.
A group based out of the University of Alberta back in 2009 measured levels of metals dissolved in the water before it flows past the oil sands, and then again after, at various distances after it passes the oil sands. And near the oil sands industry, the concentrations are slightly higher. Okay, and the conclusions have been on that basis that the oil sands industry is polluting the river. But the interesting issue here is that the oil sands industry, the surface mining, happens to be where that deposit is, where that McMurray formation, the tar or sands or bitumen material, lies very close to the surface of the earth. And it comes out into the riverbank. It outcrops into the riverbank for about 100 river kilometers, and it actively, naturally erodes into the river. And so if you make that comparison upstream and downstream of the oil sands industry, some of that increase further downstream after the waters pass by could be due to the industry, and some of that increase could be due to the natural rates of erosion. And nobody has been factoring in that natural. So I think what we've done is provided some of that important baseline information to be able to estimate to what extent the industry has, and all the other human activities in the catchment have led to any increases in metal concentration.
Roland, one thing that was pointed out in your media release is that the project was actually funded by Suncor, one of the giants of the oil sands. When people hear that, aren't you afraid now that your work might be dismissed as Suncor perhaps just getting the results that it paid for?
Yes, and 2 years ago, we published our first study from this, and that was the number one question, which essentially is, can you believe Professor Hall and his team because we got funded by Suncor? Yeah, well, that's an interesting issue. I mean, one thing is that, those of us professors at University of Waterloo, we get our research funding from a range of partners, funders, and industry is one, and I think sometimes some of the most relevant research to solve questions is sometimes funded by industry. In this case, we originally tried to get funding from the national funding agency that funds university-based researchers. All right, we pitched this idea for this study to them. It got peer-reviewed. Our colleagues who were peer reviewers, anonymous, I don't know who they were, evaluated it, said it was a really well-conceived project that was going to tackle important questions and likely yield informative results. And then that feeds into a committee that decides which of all the applications get funded or not. And that committee felt that the research we were proposing was in industry's interest and industry should pay. So we were told to go and get funding from industry. And we didn't know people in the oil sands industry. It delayed the research by 2 years. I mean, we could have had this answer a lot sooner, and that would have been helpful.
Well, thanks very much for explaining that, Roland.
You're welcome.
We've been chatting with Roland Hall, a professor at the University of Waterloo, about his study on the oil sands. In our next podcast, I will have the opportunity to speak with David Schindler, a well-known and respected scientist as well, who has done studies himself on the oil sands. His conclusions that the mining industry is certainly having an impact on the region. We'll hear from David Schindler on our next podcast. That's it for this edition of ICANN Media. I'm your host, Rob Hislop.